Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry. Good morning. Thank you again for joining us at the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Sharon, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT Sloan. As a former employee of a league, I'll let you guess which one, I'm especially excited to introduce our next panel, League Innovations, Balancing Tradition and Progress. Our all-star panelists today are Ali Curtis, Senior Vice President of Competition and Operations for MLS Next Pro and a former MLS player. Lisa Lazarus, CEO of HISA, the Horseracing Integrity and Safety Authority. Don Aponte, the NFL's Chief Football Administrative Officer. And Evan Wash, one of Sloan's favorite alums, who is also the Executive Vice President of Basketball Strategy and Analytics at the NBA. Our panel will be moderated by Allison Overholt, who is an award-winning media executive, producer, and editor, professor at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and the founder of Good People, LLC. Just to make sure everyone knows how to submit your questions, the panel will run for 45 minutes, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. You can submit your questions using the Cadence app. In the schedule pane in the app, make sure you click on League Innovations, and there will be a button to submit your questions there. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Allison.
Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here. We have a terrific panel planned for you this morning to start the day at Sloan on League Innovations. In our discussion today, we're going to delve into a range of innovations and the role that data and analytics play in both implementing those innovations and evaluating their success. From rule changes that impact the ways different sports keep things competitive and exciting, to new technology that helps evaluate risk and supports player safety. And also, we'll touch on the structural and cultural ways that organizations and leaders foster innovation within their organizations and across their external partnerships. To dive into all of this, I'm joined up here by these four brilliant executives who you've just heard about, Evan, Don, Ali, Lisa. Let's start big picture and a little bit philosophical. Innovation is such a big word. So big, in fact, that Evan mentioned the other day, it's one of the NBA's stated four corners of the core values, right? So what does innovation mean to each of you? Can you characterize for us in a day-to-day sense how you think about innovation as it applies to your organizations and your sports? Want to kick us off?
Sure. As you said, innovation is just core to the NBA. It's a core value for us, so it's ingrained in everything we do on both the business and basketball side. The way I think about it is simply how you change to create value. We have this wonderful product, basketball. It's existed for over 100 years, the NBA for over 75, but we need to be able to evolve and change with the times to create something that fans want to engage with. So really the key words for me are always change and value creation.
Change and value creation. How do you think about it?
Similarly, I would say a word I always think about is improvement. How to improve through the use of technology, research, data, and analytics, and it's improving the game, the player, health and safety, as well as just the overall fan engagement, fan experience, and that's whether you're watching the games live in the stadiums or on any of the other media platforms.
So I would say that it's also improvement, but holding on to the core essence of your sport. You know, kind of balancing that tradition and innovation. You know, horse racing is the oldest sport in America. The first Kentucky Derby was in 1875, and it's about to be the 105th anniversary. So trying to find that balance between holding on to the historical pageantry, but also making sure that we're bringing the sport into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything different I can say. I was thinking about this last night and the only thing I could think of was like change, evolve, adapt, then I thought, that's really not that cool. And so I was just trying to think of, when I was a kid and in my math and science classes, I was always taught that, the constant variable is change. And so, when I think of MLS and MLS Next Pro and really the sport of soccer, it's how can we create new rules, little iterations, little evolutions that can help support what we all love and what we all do. And then how do you create a culture and an atmosphere to support that?
So if that's innovation in the broadest philosophical terms, let's start homing in our conversation by talking about innovations and rule changes as they relate to competition. things that your sports are implementing to keep things exciting. So Don, the NFL, we just saw one of these in action a couple weeks ago. Talk to us about the Super Bowl overtime rule changes and the adjustments to a 17 playoff field with just the one bye. Can you talk us through the process of how the league evaluated ideas for competitive changes like that?
Sure. So as you know, everything we look at is to preserve the competitive integrity of everything that we're doing. And much of that is passed through the competition committee first and foremost. It's a process by which we have a number of different individuals on that committee, everyone from GMs, head coaches, presidents, and head coaches. So it's really just through data and analytics, it's really become sort of one of the driving forces as we bring information to them, and we talk about the overtime rule, which came into play. So a few years ago, it was more of a focus on the game, where we changed overtime from 15 minutes to the 10-minute periods, and that was pace of play, just the overall game time that we were focused on. And then one of the statistics that we've discussed over the past few years before the change was really looking at the impact of overtime and how that played from the competitive side. And we were seeing that it was, I think it was 10-2 in terms of win-loss record with teams that were receiving the ball first. So that kind of drove us to looking at it. How could we change this? What are some of the ways we could look at it? And we had all of our data and analytics folks who also do predictive modeling, and without really changing the essence of the game and how it would impact, it was brought to the attention saying we could get closer to a 50-50 split if we had both teams given the ability to possess the ball in overtime before one team could just win on the opening kickoff.
So when you start to see a piece of data like that starts to inform the way you want to make a change, how do you share that out to the teams and begin communicating to them? And then how do they receive that suggestion to make a change?
So at the end of each season, we send to the teams, as we gather the information throughout the season, we send to the teams sort of an overall statistical overview of the season. That includes the traditional statistics as well as some of the other things that we're looking at and monitoring throughout the season. So they have a preview on some of the things that we're looking at. We also receive input from the clubs. The clubs are allowed to provide their rule change proposals, and we are in the process of now looking at those for 2024. And before you mentioned the additional playoff team, the 7th playoff team in each conference. And that was really something, again, to increase the competitiveness all the way down the stretch now that we have a 17-game season through 18 weeks. And an example of that this year was Buffalo. So week 18, Buffalo could have been anywhere from the 2 seed, the 7 seed, or out of the playoffs. So those are the kind of competitive matchups that we want to see. So those are what we've been kind of focused on.
Nice. Ali, I'd love for you to jump into the conversation here and share what's happening in Major League Soccer, because soon you'll be implementing new rules that were ideated and trialed in MLS Next Pro, right? So the off-field treatment rule and the time substitution rule. First, can you explain what those rules are? And then I'll ask you a little bit about how they came to be.
Yeah, so the off-field treatment rule is a rule that we implemented in July of 2022. It's the objective of it is to really reduce kind of gamesmanship and match delays, but then also to kind of help improve player health and safety. And then we have this time substitution rule that is really just to speeden up, substitutions and subs, so you can kind of, reduce the gamesmanship and improve and have more soccer, more games being played. So
how do you think that they'll actually do that?
I'll give you functionally in terms of how Dawn described, hey, this is how an idea becomes a concept, becomes a rule, and it gets implemented in the game. Mm-hmm. Very similar to a lot of the other leagues. We have a board. We don't have a competition committee. Instead, we have it's called a product strategy committee. All of our GMs or sporting directors are represented on what we call a CSO committee, and they are able to provide input. We created an on-field innovation committee, which is specifically designed to start to think through some of these new innovations and new ideas. And it's really, really hard. I had there was a meeting or a conversation that I was in about a year ago, and someone asked me, how hard is it to implement this off-field treatment rule or this time substitution rule? And I said, it's the hardest. It is the hardest conversations I've ever had, because these sports have been around so long, and it's sports, and sports people are emotional about it. And so it's really important that our process is collaborative, we're thoughtful about what we do, and then we're very strong in terms of, how we go about doing that. So in terms of the off-field treatment rule, we're super excited about it. It's I think you guys have all watched the World Cup. You've seen global soccer. You've seen it in MLS, where players are going down for a potential injury and those types of things. And we've been able to reduce that in a dramatic way. What we did, we analyzed how many times players were going down for potential injuries, what was happening when those injuries happened, all the different times. Were they being substituted as a result? Was there a long-term or short-term injury as a result? And so we really tried to kind of analyze all the different things that were associated with time wasting, player health and safety, and then kind of evolving this thing and driving it forward.
Got it. All right, Evan, can you jump in here and tell us a little bit more about the NBA's play-in tournament and how that came about?
In-season?
In-season tournament, sorry.
Officially now known as the Emirates NBA Cup going forward. So we had one and only ever in-season tournament before it transitions to NBA Cup next year. Yeah, this was obviously very similar. We have processes at the league working with our competition committee, our players association, our board, business partners on how we can maximize the what we put out on the court. And we have a lot of research that shows exactly what our fans want to see on the court, which is games that have perceived competitive meaning. They want to see stars participating. They want to see a style of play that's fun to watch, and they want good game flow. And so one of the things that was discussed for really over a decade was how do we use this window that we have in the regular season from October to April and just create a heightened competitive importance to some of those games. Obviously, our players and fans really get up for Christmas Day and opening week and our ABC Saturdays and historically All-Star. But we saw this window where there was this perception that maybe the competition was lacking a little bit, and our data wasn't exactly painting a dire picture there, but there was this untapped opportunity. And so that was the genesis of it, and obviously helped that we had success with the play-in tournament that shows you can actually change these long-standing sports for the better. And so we came up with this concept to create a secondary championship, actually following what many other sports, including MLS, do around the world, to have more than one trophy. And worked over a process of multiple years with those stakeholders to try to figure out how to fit it into the existing competition, because we didn't want to take away from that.
Yeah. So how do you land on the format and structure of the tournament? Yesterday at the Multiplier Summit, I heard you share some tidbits about how your team prototype formats with fans by sharing almost movie trailers about the new concept.
Yeah, so we had this brainstorming session where there's like infinite ways you can structure a tournament. And you could either connect it to your season or have it separate. You could schedule in different ways. And we were looking at it and saying, well, how are we actually going to figure out what is going to resonate with fans? So you can do survey, you can ask fans. We actually have the benefit of having 2 affiliate leagues in our NBA family that have their own secondary tournament. So we were able to look at the WNBA's Commissioner's Cup, the G League Showcase Cup. We can study other sports. We said, if we have this like 10 to 15 broad concepts for a tournament, like how do we test those? And so one of the creative things we did was, as Allison said, to create these like mini movie trailers, these 90-second clips to build hype around the tournament, but then tweak different elements in them, and then obviously randomized in a study what an individual fan saw and sort of rated their reaction to it. So like how does a fan react to a group stage versus a knockout tournament, to 4 games versus 8 games, and tried to piece together some insight from that. We still then had to figure out with our players and our teams and our business partners if the optimal format would even work, because sometimes just because something is best from a fan perspective, it may not be practically feasible, but that was a key input to our process.
So just from a practical standpoint, for everyone in the audience who's thinking, oh, how do I implement a kind of testing protocol like this? What's the time frame on a testing process like that? How long do you take to do that?
15 years. The first concept of a mid-season tournament was actually, I think, proposed around 2008.
Wow.
But our accelerated testing was really over, I would say, a 12-month stretch, and it was leading into collective bargaining last year, and so we knew as part part of those discussions, we needed to have some robust fact-based support for what we were trying to build with the tournament. So we were doing research over maybe a 6 to 12 month period.
Got it. Okay. So we touched on this in a couple of comments already, but another element of innovation and rule changing isn't about balancing the competitive advantage piece or even engaging fans by keeping things more exciting. It's about supporting player and participant safety. So Lisa, I wanted to start with you on this because the organization that you are leading is itself an innovation. It's created for the express purpose of providing oversight of horse racing at the sport-wide level for the first time in history. Yeah. Can you tell us first a little bit more about how HISA came to be?
Sure. So horse racing was historically, for decades, governed state by state by the state sporting and gaming commissions. And they never actually had one central national governing body or one league like everyone else here does. And so the last 5 years or so were tough on horse racing. There were a number of high-profile horse deaths. And essentially Congress got involved. And Congress said, listen, we want to preserve this historic sport that's been around for centuries, but we need to make sure that the participants are safe. And so they passed the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act at the end of 2020. It was a bipartisan initiative. It was led by Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer, and it had significant support. But what it did was it created actually our league, our governing body, and our focus in these sort of initial years, because we've only actually been in effect or implemented for the last 2 years, is to make sure that we can keep horses safe and also the jockeys who ride them safe, because ultimately the future of horse racing depends on that. We live in a society, in a community that doesn't tolerate and shouldn't tolerate our athletes facing risks and facing safety issues. And so we are really built to prioritize that, and we are using a lot of data analytics and technology to really help us get there. Horse racing is a very data-rich sport, and so partnering with companies like AWS and Palantir, we're working very hard on really harnessing those analytics to help us identify and predict what horses are at risk for injury, what racetracks present challenges that we need to rectify.
What are some of the variables that you're looking at in those data streams? Because it was really powerful on our call earlier this week when you were describing what's at stake for your sport. It's literally a matter of life and death.
It is literally a matter of survival. If horse racing can't minimize or potentially even eliminate the risk of horse injury and horse death, I don't think that sport has a future. Fortunately, we're doing a terrific job in terms of getting there. And the newest sort of algorithm that we now have in place on our beta testing looks at sort of 72 different data points related to a horse. And the things that would sort of be understandable to this crowd would be, whether a horse has been on sort of what we would call injured reserve, whether or not the horse has taken a big drop in class, like racing at a level that's much lower than previously. Have they changed their trainer? What are the sort of the tracks that they're racing at? Are those tracks that are historically potentially less safe? So all of that data essentially gets put into an algorithm, and we, on a daily basis, will send a list to every racetrack of what that race card looks like for the day and what the comparative risks are per horse, so that they can then take their veterinarians, sort of go through that and make sure that they're looking at the horses that are most at risk to see whether or not they actually should race that day or should be scratched.
Wow, 72 data points. Is there anything among those 72 that surprised you in terms of what has turned out to be most predictive of risk for a horse?
We're still looking at, what's most effective. And one of the things that our veterinary teams do is also, and this would never have occurred to me, but I think, there's 70, I'm not a data scientist. There's 72 data points that go into this kind of black hole, and they spit out really interesting information. But what I hadn't really given a lot of thought to is how important it is that you get the weighting right. That the factors that are most important actually carry the most weight in that algorithm. So things that I might not have thought about is, a particularly long layoff. Sometimes you think, okay, that means the horse is recovering, they're getting rest, but actually that can really be a risk factor. Too many too many races in a certain period of time can actually be too much, almost like overtraining.
Yep.
So that can also be a flag. Certain, as I said, changes in trainers. So there's just a lot of things that as we go through this process, we're also learning a lot about the sport. And what we're trying to do, I think Ali mentioned this in terms of working collaboratively, is we're trying to give our industry also back some of this data so that the trainers and the horsemen feel like, okay, this makes a lot of sense, this is helpful, and helps them guide their training and ultimately what horses they place in which races and when.
So are there any particular changes that you've already implemented just in these first couple of years?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like playing rules or on the field play is we have much stricter requirements in terms of the pre-race veterinary exams, in terms of what a horse has to go through to be considered like fit to play or fit to race. We also have a much stricter anti-doping program. You know, the horses go through a very significant sort of anti-doping protocol. Unlike humans, it's not as straightforward. You can't tell them to go, pee in a stall. We've actually have to have veterinary teams that take urine, and when horses, you can't actually force a horse to urinate. So when they don't, we take blood and sometimes hair. But we've really gotten a lot more sophisticated also with that testing protocol, because obviously keeping the horses drug-free, substance-free is a huge priority for the integrity of the game and also the safety.
Absolutely. So Dawn, I know you're no stranger to embracing an expanded use of data and analytics around health and safety for players in the NFL. Can you tell us more about that, particularly the digital athlete tool that you've talked about, tracking and monitoring activity load, practice intensity?
Sure. So I think, just going back, one of the things that Lisa mentioned was sharing data back. So I think in the player health and safety space, that's something that we have not only learned over time, as opposed to just having one group providing the data and analytics, proposing a rule change, and then having to have ownership and membership vote on it. I think that's been helping us to be successful in implementing these efforts, because ultimately anything that we change has to be something that can be has to be able to be coached, it has to be able to be adjusted in playing by the players, and it has to be able to be officiated. So in terms of the data that we're collecting, I think, you mentioned digital athlete. That's something that without the buy-in and the understanding as to what we're looking to change and why we're looking to change it would not be a useful tool. It's in its early stages. It's, I think between the player tracking information that clubs are collecting on their own, it feeds into that, and then they're able to take that to help monitor things like players' load and just other things to make decisions in terms of their practice and playing throughout the week. So,
makes sense. So a lot of what we've talked about so far around innovation to support health and safety has been through the application of new technology, as well as utilizing the new data streams that technology enables. Can we also talk about technological innovations and the way that tech itself is helping to advance the game? Dawn and Evan, you've both talked about the use of Hawkeye in your games. Can you share a little bit more about how that's being used and how that's changing the game?
Sure, yeah, I can go first. So this is the first year of our new Hawkeye partnership. They replaced Second Spectrum as the player tracking provider throughout the NBA. And what the Hawkeye system enables us to do is capture in real time player pose, whereas previously we had just center of mass XY coordinate and with a delay such that it really couldn't be used live in game. So obviously tons of player health and safety applications, basketball analytics, and from my world also lots of officiating applications. So we have a vision that this type of technology will over time help us to automate a lot of the more difficult black and white calls in our game to allow our referees to focus on those really difficult judgment plays. And so we're taking small steps and being really purposeful about how we roll it out. But with launch this year, we focused on goaltending, which is kind of an easy starting point from a technology standpoint. So what we have this year is in our replay center, there's an overlay, an augmented feed essentially coming in with an overlay that has the trajectory of the ball as well as whether the ball is over the cylinder. And so on a challenge or a review of a goaltending play, that replay center referee now has this additional tool available to them to look at, was when the ball was touched, was it already past its apex? Is it in the cylinder? Confirm, overturn the call. And you can start to envision other things you could build into that, right? Did it hit the backboard? Was a toe on the line? Who touched the ball last? So over the next few years, we plan to roll out more of those tools. And then once we have enough of them, consider whether it actually makes sense to automate those things, right? As opposed to having the human call that play in game, do we then default to the technology? Much like tennis has done in their majors. And so that's a process we've started and one that we're really excited about.
The NFL's used it for longer, right?
Yes, we have, and I don't know that we're going to get away from individuals making the ultimate call, but certainly has assisted in many ways. So we implemented Hawkeye primarily for the officiating side of the house, and they have used it, and it really was driven by a question around the integrity of the game. The way that we were operating was in replay was that we were only getting the angles that the networks were providing to us. So Hawkeye was a way for us to receive all of the angles and also have the ability to manipulate and see those angles on our own without waiting for the data dump coming from the truck. So that has been super helpful and impactful in terms of just expediting replays, and also in terms of just having the ability to see a lot of different angles, because in any one game we could have probably a minimum of maybe 10 cameras, but in the single window games we have upwards of 35, sometimes even up to 40 cameras. So then as that has evolved, I think where we've kind of seen it be beneficial, we also use it for our injury review. So every stadium has an injury review individual who looks at those. They can call down to the spotters on the field if they see something that an official didn't or somebody else on the field didn't, where a player may have gotten injured. And then, as time has gone on, we've now used it for something that we have implemented, I think 3 years ago, which is replay assist. That allows the assistant in the booth who's working with the replay official to see things, and objective things such as, was the foot on the line? Or, did the ball come out before his knee hit the ground? Those are things that, without having to have a coach challenge, that they're objective things that can be seen and assisted by the replay booth upstairs, and also in our office in New York. So over the past 3 years, I think we've had something like 100 calls where we've corrected incorrect, corrected decisions that would have otherwise had to potentially been challenged.
Ali, is MLS looking to implement anything similar to this, or?
Yeah, I think, at the time I was the sporting director at Red Bull in 2015, but, MLS was the first league to implement, VAR. So when you see the referee do the little square and run over to the camera, and, it's a video review and those types of things. So, and then the clubs, a lot of the times the clubs, they have their players, they wear these vests and they're able to analyze player behavior, player data, and those types of things. And then there's just so many things that happen during the course of 90 minutes during a soccer game, on the field. There's all these little events that you see, and then there's a lot of things that you may not see. And so what we've done is we've tried to analyze every single thing that's happening within the lines in order so that we can, one, have a better product, a better game that's more exciting, more compelling, and safer for our players. And so that was, part of that was the genesis of why we created, the off-field treatment rule. I'm sure a lot of you guys watched the World Cup in 2022. You saw how long those games were. A game is typically 90 minutes, and sometimes you saw games that were 115, 120 minutes. And we want more soccer. We love the game and all those types of things. And so we're trying to analyze all these different events. There's 40 throw-ins that happen a game. How long are those throw-ins? Where are they taking place? Why? So there's just all these different events that happen in a soccer game, and we're trying to support, what's been happening. So yeah.
Nice. Okay, so segueing off the field, but staying within technology, Evan, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the NBA Startup Incubator and the role that NBA Launchpad plays in advancing the league's overall goals.
Yeah, so Launchpad is something we started a few years ago, and the vision here was that there's obviously tons of fantastic technology out there, some geared towards sports, some less so. But it wasn't always clear to sports technology companies what the specific problems that leagues and teams were facing. So we thought there was an opportunity to present out to the marketplace what we were facing, the challenges we see, the strategic opportunities we see, and have companies come back to us with solutions that they can develop. And it's worked really well. So essentially each year we'll put out a set of topics or areas, technology areas, and ask for solutions and evaluate what comes back. We get hundreds of submissions every year. We put 4 to 6 companies ultimately through the process, and we've done everything from preventing ankle injuries to elite youth basketball development to advancing the women's game to referee training and development. And we've got some fantastic companies in our Launchpad portfolio over the years. Many are working with NBA teams, working with the league now. And it's just helped us really accelerate technology development in spaces that we think are really strategically important for the game. We also now have a business side track to that as well. So there's 3 tracks on the business side that complement the basketball work that we started.
I love it. That also helps us to come full circle back to where we originally started on the bigger picture topic of innovation and the role that it plays in each of your organizations. So I'd love to spend these last few minutes before we throw to questions in the audience, hearing how do each of you actually go about fostering a culture of innovation among your staffs? To set that up a little bit more, I think for far too long, so many people thought that innovation was about like a lightning strike that some individual genius would just experience and then suddenly change would happen. But research has shown us that, that lone genius myth really doesn't exist. So if true innovation requires team effort, can each of you share a little bit about how you create that culture of teamwork to foster innovation in your organizations? Lucy, you want to start?
I can start. Just before I answer, I would like to though just talk about one piece of technology that I think is also responsive. In horse racing, in the perfect world, when you have a jockey going 40 miles per hour on a horse, if something was amiss with the horse, they'd be able to know right away. Now, some of them are, incredibly experienced so they can sense it. We'd love to be able to give them a technological answer to that question, because if a jockey can pull up, go off to the side, they can potentially save not just the horse, but themselves, and also, it is quite catastrophic when a jockey falls going that quickly. So we're experimenting with wearables right now that actually we hope will be able to ultimately answer that question and tell a jockey sort of mid-race, this horse is not, its gait is different, And funny enough, we look at some of the things the NFL has done, the NBA, in terms of like load and surfaces and everything, because they've been forerunners in that space. And so we're working with companies to try to make sure that we can ultimately get to a product that helps us answer that question. In terms of fostering innovation, horse racing is, as I said earlier, a sport where a lot of folks, still have flip phones. I mean, it is not a particularly technologically savvy demographic. And I think that what we do sort of on our team is we try to look at everything from a completely different perspective. Try to unlearn some of the things that, horse racing might have historically put in our minds and look to other leagues and to other sort of first movers on, what is out there that can ultimately kind of make us do our job better. And I think, in terms of leadership, it's just incredibly important that nobody ever thinks there's a bad idea. That nobody's ever, afraid to speak up and put something on the table, because some of the best ideas come from the least likely of sources and places. And I think, fostering a culture of openness and dialogue and also engagement with stakeholders is incredibly important if you want to move an industry forward.
I think similar. We probably are most similar to horse racing in terms of the traditional mindset, and I think we've continued to follow some of the things you're saying in terms of having an open mind, giving people a platform to share their ideas, being collaborative. But I also think, being intentional is important about it. And things such as, you had mentioned, Ali, the Innovation Committee. We do have a Future of Football Committee and works hand in hand with a lot of the other departments within football operations, as well as with the Competition Committee. And we engage also the teams, ownership, and other executives to participate on that. So I think it really is about being intentional and making sure we understand what some of the issues are or concerns that would potentially impact the integrity of the game, the competitiveness of our game, and how do we grow and evolve that to ensure that we're continuing to, improve and get better at all times.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to be thoughtful and collaborative, and then you've got to be strong if you're going to really evolve and change things. But, at the end of the day, for me, it boils down to, really leadership and results. I think people know what it feels like when they can walk into a room and they can feel safe to open up, to present their ideas, to share things that they've been working on in the background for months and years and those types of things. And that boils down to leadership and the atmosphere and the culture that you create within a room. And that's important. And then, that will last only so long. You have to have some results to support everything that you're doing, such that your colleagues and the people that are supporting all these ideas continue on, and that's super, super important. And so, I think leadership and results have been something that's been really helpful and valuable for us. And like we mentioned before, all the other things that have been mentioned in terms of competitive integrity and integrity of the game, super, super important.
Yeah, I'd love to come back to a point you made earlier and actually underline it a little bit when you mentioned that sports are emotional. We're at an analytics conference and we're talking about, a testing process and feedback and data streams and, making, evidence-based decisions, but balancing that with the fact that there are these rich traditions and cultures of all these sports, plus a fundamentally, emotional pull towards, those end results. And then on top of that, transformative change is emotional for people in an organization. How do you balance the cultures of data-driven decision-making and the fundamental human emotions around sports and around change? I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
Yeah, I would echo what Dawn said. So that the value that I mentioned, that NBA, one of their core values, is not just innovate, it's innovate with intention. And then to Ollie's point, it has to be shared. That vision for the future has to be shared among all of the stakeholders. And I think one thing that doesn't get discussed a lot for us is, I don't know where we would be with virtual connectivity if not for COVID, but pre-COVID we had 3 board meetings a year, 1 general managers meeting a year. We would meet with our Players Association occasionally. In a world of Zoom, we are constantly meeting with all of those groups, and it allows us to move much more quickly and shape the things that we're building together. So when we look at something like the in-season tournament, there are so many specific elements of that were suggested directly by star players or the union or our network partners or our board of governors, that we were able to move quickly and adjust elements of that. Like the league office, many of us have never played an NBA basketball game. We've never coached an NBA basketball game. We don't know what it would mean emotionally to these players to compete in this event. So the more we can work in their views, their suggestions in the design process, then you have that shared vision, shared accountability, so that everyone wants to see what you're creating succeed and you get the results that Ollie talked about. So I actually think we benefited from the virtual connectivity acceleration that happened as a result of COVID, and that's let us do things like the play-in tournament, the in-season tournament, let us successfully execute our new CBA on an accelerated timeline. So we're thankful to have those deep relationships that we've cultivated, and ultimately leads to greater success with innovation.
Go ahead.
First of all, it's hard, right? Because you are dealing with emotion and you are trying to bridge a very, very diverse, often, ownership, athletes, participants. There are so many different stakeholder groups in most of our sports, and kind of bringing everyone on the same page is difficult. And I sort of mentioned earlier that balance between tradition and innovation. It's almost like it's almost like an art, not a science. But I think ultimately it is about a lot of consultation. It is about trying things out before you implement them. I think it's about transparency, being honest with what you're trying to achieve. And then if you don't get it quite right, being nimble enough and willing enough to adjust. And I think also just being authentic in communicating that this is all about making the sport better and preserving it for the future. And if you can kind of get people aligned on that concept, which is maybe a little bit different in horse racing, then I think you can typically get a fair amount of support. But taking someone's favorite sport that they've lived and grown up in and tweaking it at all is can be dangerous business. And so you've got to approach it, I think, in a really thoughtful and appropriate way.
So I'm actually going to weave in a question from the audience that relates very closely to all of this as we continue to talk here. Question that came in: social media reactions to new ideas can often be very negative initially, even if over time the changes prove to be well liked. How do you balance listening to your fans with the time that it takes for new changes to actually be appreciated?
I think that, again, going back to it's the being intentional, it's taking into account their feedback, and to the passionate piece, like they're responding, we have to listen. And I think it's not reacting, which oftentimes is your initial thought. It really is understanding, it's being able to educate. I think on a lot of these things, it's the educational piece of the why behind what we're doing, and whether it's for the competitive side of it or for the player health and safety side, new ideas by traditionalists are not always, quickly accepted. But I think over time and seeing how those, whether it's technology or changes to the game, are beneficial, and really it ultimately comes back to the competitiveness. And we see that is in our sport, we continue to thrive on the competitive side. Games are exciting, they're engaging, and I think that's kind of if you stick to the purpose of why you're doing it and making sure that others understand that, I think you have a much better chance of success.
Ali, I've got a specific one for you.
Okay.
How do you balance making changes that make MLS a unique product versus staying similar to European leagues to gain a global audience?
That's a good question. We're all playing the same. We all play the same game. We all love the same game. I grew up playing the sport because my favorite player. I would read books about this guy by the name of Pele, and he was like, he was for me the best player ever, and he looked like me, and that was inspiring. And and I think that when I think about that, it's about connection to the sport. I remember my dad and my mom used to take me to soccer practice, and these are things that are happening in the U.S. and Canada in Major League Soccer with our youth academies in MLS Next and Next Pro and MLS, and it's the same thing that's happening in Central and South America, and it's the same thing that's happening overseas. And so it's really important that we always come from a place where we love this game, we love this sport, it is the global game. How can we all collectively work together and collaboratively to improve and to evolve and to adapt? And so, as we talk about innovation and those types of things, a word that we've been using on this panel throughout has been communication. And so, that communication is not just within our departments, within our organizations, within our enterprise, and within our sports industry, but that's also across the global community. And so we're connected with FIFA, we're connected with IFAB, all the other leagues, all the other teams. Some of the owners that own teams in Major League Soccer also own teams in other leagues around the world. So listen, it's about being connected and honoring how we all feel about this, incredible sport.
Dawn, we've got a specific question for you here. Not having another NFL-owned league to test and learn from, what challenges does that create in making rule changes that haven't been seen on the field? Do you leverage or keep an eye on innovation in USFL and XFL to then possibly incorporate into the NFL?
We do. We have worked very closely with the USFL, with the AAF, and which is now the UFL. They've all merged. We're dealing with the UFL now. But yes, we meet with them. We talk with them regularly. They have shared whether it's player health and safety information, as well as some of the rules changes. And as we look at one of the current ones, it's the kickoff rule. So that's something that last year, based on data, the NFL had made a change and went to a one-year only rule change to the kickoff. And we have been tracking it, and that is probably one of our biggest discussions this offseason with not only the competition committee, but engaging the special teams coaches, and also looking at some of the data and options that we would have for implementation.
Here's a good one. You've all talked about different committees and groups that you test things with and discuss things with. How do you pivot or adapt the innovations you're proposing when a governing body votes against them? And how do you get buy-in?
So we had most innovations or proposals that we bring to our governing body, we've built the support that we expect it will pass once it gets to that level, because we've done the work to bring those stakeholders along in the journey. We had an instance, I want to say in 2014, where we proposed changes to our draft lottery. And the ultimate vote of our board was 17-13 in favor, but it actually required a supermajority of 22 or 23 or 20 votes, so it fell short. And it surprised us, because what we didn't realize is we hadn't sort of heard out all the concerns around the proposal from different stakeholders, largely on the team basketball side. And so we had to go back to the drawing board, and I think that was the point at which we realized that we need to do a better job making sure that before we even bring something to the table, we understand where everyone in the room is. And so we were able to successfully, 3 years later, come back with a modified version of that same proposal.
3 years later, though.
Yeah.
I mean, this is pause on that. Yeah.
Team situations at the time impacted how teams viewed the proposal, and so 3 years later, there was a little bit more flexibility to what we were talking about to drive more competition in the game. But it was just a great example of if you don't have that, if you don't do that work up front, you're going to run into some of those roadblocks. So we obviously now work a lot on the upfront
Seemed
part.
on
I would say our process is very similar in terms of making sure that you get the proper committees to buy in, that you are getting the talking points, that you're also speaking with ownership. Ultimately, we need 24 votes to pass a rule. So it comes back to ownership, and it's making sure that it has been vetted properly, and you need to be able to answer the questions when they're answered and on the floor. So that's very similar in terms of making sure that we're doing our due diligence before putting a rule up to vote.
So what does that actually look like? Because I've heard each of you say something similar today. Doing the work, knowing what the sentiment is in the room. For folks in the room here who, maybe haven't gone through a process like that before, what does that actually mean? Does that mean you're sharing all the details of what you're proposing in advance and taking it around person by person or group by group? Can you walk us through what does it look like to build stakeholder support for something?
You want me to?
Sure.
We, like I've mentioned earlier, we created this rule called the off-field treatment rule. It helps with player health and safety, but it also helps with kind of faking injuries and things like that, and gamesmanship. What we did was, we're all fans of the game, right? And we watch the game and we see what's going on, and we said, oh, you know what? That's something that I wish that player wasn't doing that, or I wish that team wasn't doing that. You have this theory, and then you start to look at different data points and different numbers, and you say, wow, we might have something here. And at this point, we're in the league office. And at this point, we're also, we're talking to our colleagues that are within the league office. We're also talking to our peers that are at the clubs. And we start discussing these ideas and these concepts. And so what we did was we created this on-field innovation committee. Myself and a few others, we lead that within the league office. We selected 11 members from 11 different clubs to participate on this on-field innovation committee. That committee meets 3 to 6 times per year. You have a meeting that's usually about an hour to 2 hours. You talk about different ideas, different concepts. It takes a long time to figure out if this is the right rule. Hey, we may have something here. You think about really overarching concepts. Hey, player health and safety, gamesmanship, attacking soccer, some of those kind of, what I would say is, if you can align on kind of the big items, then it allows you to then kind of figure out the details of what it is. And so for us, we created this smaller committee the On-Field Innovation Committee, where it took us some iterations, some meetings, some conversations. After we aligned internally with the Innovation Committee, I spoke to different people from the youth soccer community, spoke to different national team coaches, spoke to, in soccer, you have FIFA and you have IFAB, which they represent the international soccer community, spoke to them. So various different constituents, and then whether it's a competition committee, we have a product strategy committee, which is again another subset of our ownership group. To the extent that they're on board with our new rule, we present them with data, and then we also present them with our opinions and our ideas about why we think this is important and why we think it's helpful. At the time, for our off-field treatment rule, we rolled it out in MLS Next Pro in the summer of 2022. They said, and then after a few months, we gave them the data. They said, hey, that looks great. Come back to us in 6 to 12 months and let us see more data and how it's working. We did that, and we came back to the product strategy committee. We showed them information about what was going on. They liked it, and then we recommended it to the full board. So all the owners within Major League Soccer, they were able to vote on that, approve it, and then it's implemented in MLS. So it's really a series of what I would say is, how does an idea get to a market? You're watching a game and you see something that maybe you don't like, and you investigate that and you research that a little bit more. And then you start talking to different people, and then you create a committee, and that committee then talks to other different committees. And you know what? We've got to implement the medical experts from the medical community, because as we talked about earlier, everybody's got to, is invested in this. And despite if the rule is effective and productive, and despite if it makes sense from an objective perspective, it's also super emotional. And that's not lost on us in the sense that sports is really, really emotional, and you have to honor that because it crosses generations. And so as you think about creating alignment, you think about all the different opinions that you may have, the objective data that you may have, but also the conversations that you're going to need to have in order to really gain support to implement something.
Well, and that's the perfect place for us to end. From the philosophical to the nuts and bolts, you all have really taken us inside your processes and your ideas. So I just want to thank Ali and Lisa and Don and Evan for a great hour, and we'll wrap there.